everyone. Welcome back to Innovation Nation. Today we have Debora Finkler with us. Debora, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting. I am Debora Finkler. I was born and raised in Brazil. I came to the US on my early 20s after getting my bachelor's in marketing communications in Brazil. And I'm just now recently completing a year at my new job as change management lead and national communications manager for Blackstone Consulting, Inc., with a huge healthcare provider contract they have. Before that, I came from 11 years at Image Sales on the vendor side. They do ID and visitor management.
Amazing. Thank you for introducing yourself. So before we get started, just so the listeners know, I've known Debora now for about 4 years. We both are involved in ASIS and have overlapped over the years and have been to many events together. So I'm excited today because I get to bring you on. You get to teach us some of your wisdom. And I wanted to start off, before we get into the whole nitty gritty of the conversation, I'd like if you can help us understand a little bit around what change management means and what you're doing. Please, you don't have to mention anything about your client, but would love to kind of understand what that looks like in your current scope of work.
Absolutely. So, like I said, it's a healthcare provider. It's a big corporation with footprint in 8 different regions in the US. And the security organization of that corporation has over 3,000 people total, counting everybody that's on the client side, plus our officers. And I work in the National Security Services field initiatives and strategy team. So we own the project management office, and we also have our own programs that we run in the people strategy world and a few others. But my role specifically, it crosses over all the national projects because I own the communication strategy. So my job is to consult with the teams and help their projects be more successful basically. So I help them manage the changes that their projects are going to affect the field. So I help them define, the best way to communicate, the best way to implement the tools they're creating, and how to roll out their plans successfully and make it stick, right? So that's what's the change management part of my role is about. But on the communication side, a huge part of my role is organizing the massive amount of information we have to, share among each other, make sure the right people have the right information at the right time, it's easy to find. And also creating tools for our teams to be better communicators, like templates and trackers and tips on meeting efficiency, libraries, resources. It's fun. It's a lot of work, but I love it.
Yeah, that's a lot to digest when it comes to what you're doing on a daily basis. And I'm curious if you can, help me understand what that process looks like for you, especially when technology is involved, right? Like technology changes so fast, and I'm sure you're utilizing it a lot to not only help you with your job and with the communication, but I'd love to understand like how, you utilize it, maybe whether it's with your client in your daily job through that change management that you're doing.
Yeah, so that reminds me of a previous conversation you and I had about how COVID really pushed folks to learn technology, right? That they weren't used to. Like you at JCI had so many people on the field all the time, and all of a sudden they had to adapt to a remote work situation. And a lot of that is educating, right? How to use the tools, how to pretty much how to utilize the tools to help your job and not just be overwhelmed by it and not take advantage of all the benefits they bring. So a lot of my job is, because we have such a diverse workforce with people from 18-year-old to over 60, 70-year-old, how to make sure communications are efficiently among all these different generations and the gaps that come with that, right? So when you and I talk about this podcast, we were talking about back in the day on the event. It might be the event we met each other for the first time, where David Rickerson, when he was a chair of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter for ASIS, he mentioned to us how important it is for the older generation in the industry to be mentoring the young professionals, because 50% of the industry is about to retire. It's like close to retiring years, right? So we have a huge generation gap inside our security industry. And the moment you start bringing up that, you know, you need to work together, you need to cross the generational gaps, you start really seeing the clash, right? Like you hear the older generation saying, hey, these millennials, they just want everything handed over to them. They don't want to put on the groundwork that we all did for years until we get where we are. And then you hear on the other side, the younger generations is like, oh, those boomers, they hate change. They don't want to learn new technology. It's just such a drag. Instead of focusing on the common challenges, you know, and the commonalities they have to be stronger and work together, which works for, you know, other gaps like gender and religion and race and all that, but let's focus on communication today.
No, of course. I mean, so, you know, you mentioned a couple things, and, you know, I'd love to kind of pick that apart piece by piece. The first thing I'd like to kind of get more insight from you on is, you know, you do mention that I do remember the conversation that we had when we were talking about how COVID hit, and for the listeners to have some context, we were talking about the fact that, you know, not only did COVID create a big rift for a lot of us just in our daily lives, but it kind of pushed a lot of people out of their comfort zone when it comes to communication via tech and via all the different communication tools we have right now, like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Slack, and just all these different ways that we can all communicate: email, phone call, video chats. And it was interesting because we were talking about how, you know, I guess I remember I shared with you how when I was at JCI, we at the time were utilizing like 4 different communication tools. We had Zoom, we had WebEx, we had Microsoft Teams, and I think we also had Skype. And not only were we using those 4 different tools, but our organization was like thousands of people, I mean, in the hundreds. And we had so many different age variances of people working together, not just internally, but externally. And we we're also going through digital transformation at the time. So we were taking all those 4 tools, we were consolidating them, we were moving everyone over to Microsoft Teams, not on purpose because of COVID,
Right.
just coincidentally, JCI had already planned to go through a digital transformation. And I remember, like, from our conversation, Deborah, you were sharing with me a little bit around communication styles and how, you know, with the tools we have, it varies, right, by generation and how people like to communicate. Can you help kind of break that down and how that translates to today and to how you're seeing the different generations interact with each other and kind of get out of their comfort zones altogether?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to pound a key that it's meeting people where they are, right? And my boss and mentor, Liz Rice, she has a term I adopted immediately because I love it's technology natives versus technology immigrants, right? So these latest generations, people born late in the 90s and up, they were born with technology all over their face. The latest generations, if you think like 2000s and up, they were born with a tablet on their face, so they're used to the speed of technology changes. They're used to that. Doesn't affect them because were born with that stimulus. It's part of their upbringing, right? Versus the older generations that are immigrants to technology. The if you think about it, these friends we have at ASIS that are part of that 50%, they probably spent most their careers doing things in a certain way just because those were the resources available in terms of technology. And then they had to start adapting in the 80s and 90s, and then in the 2000s, the speed of technology change were even faster. They had to adapt again and again. If you think about it, 10 years ago, it was already fast changing. And then 5 years ago, even more, and now more. So they keep having to adapt and readapt, and they're immigrants to it. So it can be very overwhelming. And what I consider a good communicator is someone that is empathic, right? So they emphasize they make sure they are meeting people where they are to be able to adapt that message to how their audience needs to receive it, right? So that's the main thing for me. And if you think of, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, because you bring up a point, right? Meeting people where they are, right? And you have the immigrants and you have the folks who are native to the technology, right? So like if you break that down, let's think about that for a second. You have the folks like people like myself, where, for example, we're introduced to a new app. And, for me, it might take like 10 minutes to download it, turn it, like get it turned on, like get myself registered, and I'm ready to go, right? Like, and that's inherent. That's like human nature for me, is
Yeah.
to just add to my toolkit, right? And it's very easy to understand how to do that. And then you have that 50%, right? And when you're being kind of forced to make a change where you're not used to doing that on a regular basis, I can imagine that's probably really hard, right? And when you're
Yeah.
talking with teams, for your role with what you do in change management, I'm assuming there's a variance of people with all different ages, right? And all different styles of communication that you're working with.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's another success tip for corporations and people that have to communicate to massive amounts of people like that could fall into different categories, is to have repetition in different types of channels, right? So for this podcast, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the different generations and their drivers, and then tie that back to what makes a good communicator, this whole thing about meeting people where they are. So let's start with the generation stuff, okay? So we have the baby boomers. These are the folks that were born after the war, the Second World War, and so they were born on that baby boom. So we're thinking mid 40s to mid 60s, and their driver is legacy creation. They came from a destructive world that had to be recreated, and they had that sense of like leaving something behind, right? So they're based on their upbringing, their information processing preferences is audio. So that's why it's so much better to have a phone call with them or in-person conversation, or jump on a meeting. Then you have the next generation over, that's the Gen X. Those are the doers. So they're all about doing and making it happen. Those are folks mid 60s to mid 80s, born in the mid 60s to mid 80s, and their driver is work and money and the fear of losing that. So there's a pattern, right? Like they were raised by the folks with the legacy creation, so they know the importance of keeping that alive, right? And their information process is way more visual. So it makes sense with the technology progress as well, right? So at that point, there was much more visual tools available. So the best channels communicating to that generation is going to be emails and graphics, infographics, presentations, very visual generation. And then you have the Gen Y, also known as millennials, depending on the source. They are the improvers. So they were raised by the doers, right? And they are not with that fear of losing it, because it was built, it was maintained. So their driver is development and collaboration and sharing and improving things. And their information processing is much more tactical. So they like interaction, they like instant messages, they like videos, they like chat rooms and apps, like you said. And then you have the even younger generation that, to make us all feel old, we realize that they're already in the workforce, right? Because these are the folks born in after 2000. So they are 20 years old. They're in the workforce, and they're all about speed. That's their driver. They were born with a load of stimulus constantly, and it's all about that. They, like you mentioned one time we were talking, like their attention span is very low. It's all about like move, right? And so their information processing is much more technological. So think instant message, GIFs, apps, anything interactive is going to talk to that generation. And I'll tell you, most of them probably don't even own a printer. So nothing like in paper for these guys, right?
That is so, I have to just make a comment on that, because I have a printer. I fall into the category of I guess, millennial. I was born in 1993, but I just, it's so funny because you're like, when you categorize that and you give that overview, it's so true. I could not agree more. And I have, you know, I have a lot of coaches above me where I feel like, to your point, when which I know we're going to go into, is like how to meet someone like where they're at. It's so interesting because on a daily basis, I am communicating in so many different ways. If I'm talking to somebody that's like a coach or a mentor of mine, like, we're either like setting our call up over email, or like we're, we're planning like a week to 2 weeks ahead. And it's just like such a different way we're communicating and like getting things done, versus like when I go talk to a mentee or someone like on a team younger than me, we're texting, we're sending like pics of quotes to each other. We're like, and like we get like things are done like in that instant, and it's just like, it's such a different way of like interacting with people like through technology. And like, as you know, Deborah, like this podcast is really about industry, technology, like how we're evolving as a group. And it's just interesting because quite often I feel like we go about our days and we forget about these things. We don't realize that there are true gaps, and we need to be able to monitor and adjust and change when necessary.
Yeah, we're living in that generation of speed, right? So we have to adapt, but we also have to remember we're not all there, right? And the way to navigate these gaps is being a good communicator. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that now. Like, what one thing that a lot of people know, but we tend to forget, is that in the communication process, your words, the words itself, whatever you're writing or saying, it's only 7% of it. It's nothing, right? It's just 7% of it. So 55% of the communication process is body language, and 38% is going to be your tone. So remember the famous, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. I think everybody said that at one point in their lives, right? So if you think about it, that's the root of so many miscommunications, a text that was interpreted in the wrong way. Or even me, I'm an excellent communicator, but if you ask my husband how many times we had miscommunications because I read his text with a complete wrong tone. It's also why GIFs and emojis became so popular, right? Because text, it has this problem, right? Because it only has the 7% of communication. But now we have technology to add all these extra layers of communication elements that convey more than just the word, that convey the emotion, and mimic the face expressions, and help you add the context you need for your audience to receive that as you intended, right? If you're asking someone, hey, why the heck didn't you finish that? But like in a smiley tone, the person is you're not mad at them. If you say that in a plain text versus saying that in a plain text and adding a funny GIF with it, it's going to change the whole context of how the person is receiving that, right?
Yeah.
And just about myself, a lot of my friends call me the queen of GIFs because I use that so much, and it's probably because it just helps so much in communication. So if you ask anyone that knows me, they'll say my GIF game is on point.
Well, now I know who to go to for that, because it's funny. I do find myself quite often using smiley faces or exclamation points. And it's like, if you put the exclamation point, but you don't include the smiley face, they might think you're like yelling at them. But if you put the smiley face and they can tell you're excited, it's like, it's so interesting. And yeah, I mean, I'd love for you to also, Deborah, like, cause you mentioned earlier in when you introduced yourself, you're from, Brazil, and have lived here for quite some time now. And I'm curious if you can help us kind of understand from your personal experience as well, what that's been like with not just technology, but leading change management and being, from outside the US. I'd love to understand what some of your experience has been around that.
Yeah. So my personal challenges in terms of communication when I got here is like, of course, you were born in a whole different culture, and it's not a native language, right? So when I got here, I was in my early 20s. My English was really good enough to be here. I could understand everything people were saying, but a lot of times what happens with immigrants is in your home country, you don't have a lot of opportunities to dialogue, to speak. So my speaking language was not great. I could understand very well, but it wasn't easy to convey what I was trying to say. I always felt like, oh my God, I sound so much smarter in Portuguese because, I can say anything I want. And in here, I got like reaching those walls. So I got, when I got to Image Sales, I was here for just a little over a year. So it was much better, of course. But I was getting introduced to this whole new world of vocabulary and technical terms that I was still very fresh to it. So that was my challenge, was the more on the immigrant side and being a young woman in security. I started my bias. Usually the bias I suffered was more related to, like, people will assume because I'm here and I'm not from here that my husband is American, when I was the one giving him my Brazilian husband a green card because of my job. So those are the type of bias I usually come across. What I noticed in learning the challenges of women in security after I started getting involved with ASIS is that the folks out there, the men in our industry that do not act like allies, and I'm going to emphasize that because we do have a lot of great allies in the security industry in the Bay Area, at least the community I'm part of. But the ones that do not act like allies, they tend to be okay with women in the security industry that are more on the supportive roles like marketing and sales and admin. But usually their bias are when women are in that role of being the expertise in security, right? So my bias was more related to being an immigrant than a woman in security. And I think a lot of the reasons why I haven't had problems is because of my communication skills, right? And be able to just navigate any of these problems with my communication tools.
Yeah.
And just coming back to what we were talking about, communicating efficiently, that's why face-to-face is so much more effective, because you feel the person's energy. You can read those biases easier, right? You can observe their reactions, or even if they're, if they're receptive to your message, you can also notice those cues. And it's just about knowing your audience. Like I believe you're successful in your role because you have that ability to communicate well. And it's very common on sales jobs, sales positions, because if you think about it, the best tactic is to find out what in your audience you can relate to, so you can from there show the benefits of your product, right? And it's the same with communication. So if you think about good communicators, they're always considering those little cues and little drivers to adapt their message to their audience.
Do you have any good tools, Deborah, that you can share for the listeners? Like maybe your top 5 tips and tricks of technology and communicating, and how we can, bridge some of those gaps for those who are listening, because we have listeners from all across the board and in all different industries. And so I already know a lot of what we've discussed will be of great help, but I'd love to see if we can capture some of that in a couple tips and tricks from your experience.
Absolutely. So that's a great gateway to the next point I wanted to. It's about the elements of communication, right? So if you keep the elements of communication in your mind as you're going through your work, you will naturally fit what technology fits better for what you're doing as you go through. So I will break down, it might sound a little technical, but just keep in mind, we do all these instinctively, but once we know those elements, it's just, we're more aware and making sure we consider them on our daily interactions and stuff like that. So one of them is the sender, right? That's the basics, like who's sending this message? Who's the best person to deliver this message? For example, if I'm sending a internal communication in my organization about compliance, is this better coming from me, or I'll write and it's coming from the director of compliance? It has more authority. So just thinking, who is the best sender? And then who's your receiver? Who needs to receive this message? Okay, your audience might be your managers, but you might need to copy, you know, your regional managers and their directors and stuff like that for transparency. So thinking about the sender, the receiver, the message itself, of course, that's the main thing, right? So what is my focus? What do I want to gain with this communication? Do I need feedback? Am I just informing? Do I have my what? Do I have my why, my when, my who, my where? I cannot tell you how many times a day I'll get an email, for example, hey, can you review this for me? But they don't tell me by when they need that. And I have a ton of things in my list I need to prioritize. So I waste a little bit more time asking, hey, by when do you need this? You know, so keeping that specific thing in mind, whatever technology you're using, it's always going to be do wonders for you, because a lot of the back and forth that happens is because the initial message is not clear enough, right? Or if you're asking someone to do something but you have multiple people copied, you have to make sure you know who is owning that task. Otherwise people will be looking at each other, waiting for each other to do, for the other one to do and not do it. The other one is the medium or the channel. So that's where technology plays a huge role, right? So what is the best way to deliver this message? Nowadays, especially in our world, we have tools like Everbridge that will, like make a voicemail, a text message, and an email get to everybody that needs to get that message. And that helps with all those gaps. You're gonna get the text to the people that prefer getting stuff via text. You're gonna get the emails for people sitting on their computers, and you're gonna get the voicemails for people getting the message on their phones. So that's, I think, one of the biggest ways that technology plays a role in that element is the channel. And then we have the feedback. Feedback is a huge element of communication that a lot of times we underestimate. So am I just informing this, or do I need feedback? And how do I want that feedback? Do I want to be looking at the person to see how they're reacting, or do I want to give them time to digest that on their own time and then reply on their own time? So feedback is important. Technology will play a big role there, right? For instance, in my role, when we're about to launch a program, it's the best way to do it a lot of times is putting everybody on a Zoom call or like on Teams and going over with visual and text and being able to see their faces and their reactions and get the instant feedback we need from them, versus sending a huge email explaining the project that probably nobody's going to read the whole thing and never hear from it again. Mm-hmm. And then there's other factors like noise. Noise is when there, like, other external things may affect the way people receive that message. So that can be very literal, like, I need to reach Sarah, but I know she's on the road. I'm not going to be trying to email her and expect her to reply right away because she might have be out of reach. But maybe I'll like instant message her on LinkedIn because I know she's always checking LinkedIn, stuff like that. And then we have context. Context is huge, right? Context plays a role where the mental filter is like, does this message is in the right context? Is this conversation in the right context? Or if I add elements, it will help the person understand where I'm coming from. For example, you get to a one-on-one with someone, you're really ready to have a very like important like accountability conversation, and you get there and the person is devastated because her dog died or something. That's not the right context to have the conversation anymore, right? Because it's not going to be received well. Your main goal, your focus on your message, it's not going to work. So considering all that really makes us good communicators. But I mean, again, it's not like, oh, how am I going to remember all that? You don't have to remember. This is all good to know. So what we really have to remember is to be adaptable and to be a good listener. When you're a good listener, you learn the cues you need to better communicate. And remember, we're more similar than different. So it doesn't matter what generation we are, we can all meet at one point, right? And meeting people where they are comes from be compassionate, right? If, like I said, if the person is devastated with their dog, you're not going to tell them they're doing a bad job today. You're going to tell them another day in another context. And it's smile is universal, right? That's easy to remember. and just open to learn and to teach. That plays a big role in our industry, right? We learn so much for our older friends with all their experiences and their expertise, but we can also teach them a lot about our world and our technology. But the meeting people where they are is just, for instance, you have a client that is not very comfortable with technology. You're not going to try to shovel technology on their face. You're going to be a more gradual work and more, education. If I'm talking to a director I know is not very comfortable with the virtual collaboration tools, I'm not just going to send him an email, hey, upload your file to the cloud. I'm going to go, hey, here's some print screens of how you get to where I need you to get, So it's just about meeting people where they are. I'm going to just keep pounding that key.
Well, it's really important, I think, for a lot of people to remember that, especially during times like these when it's very easy to become robotic and it's very easy to become, methodical with like what we do, right? Because nowadays we are on virtual meetings all the time. Maybe we're not always using our camera, but it's a lot of being behind our desks, right? And we're not getting that face-to-face interaction anymore. And it's a good reminder, especially because one little tidbit I can share before we end. It's interesting because I just was out with a client for the first time in a while, and what was interesting was it wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be, just like getting back into the field, assuming like things are normal again. I actually noticed there were weird little adjustments that I had to make that were nuances, going from being like behind a computer every day to now going back to being in person. And even just the idea of having to not just be present in that moment in time for that client, but also managing everything else at the same time.
Exactly.
Because nowadays I could be on a Zoom call while sending an email, while responding to a text, 5 things at once, and not everybody's getting my best set of attention.
Exactly.
When before I go to a meeting, my phone's on do not disturb. I don't care what's happening outside.
Exactly.
And it's just so interesting because all of us humans like have been put into this position where we're now becoming kind of robotic, or at least I'm noticing myself becoming robotic. And there's gonna still now, when we get back to real life, we're gonna have to make that adjustment. We're gonna have to go back and then figure out what makes sense, right? Like now what? Because the world is never gonna be the same as what it was before.
Yeah. And we adapt.
Well, it's a matter of time, right? Like I'm excited because it being out and then kind of remembering what it's like to have that in-person interaction. There's nothing more valuable than that. It's just, it's sad in a sense, but at the same time, it then makes me, and I think others will appreciate that. Right. And
I think you're absolutely right. It will bring back that the memory of how important face-to-face interactions are, right? Even in my organization, I noticed like when COVID first hit, no one would ever turn their cameras on because people don't want to, and they're home and they don't have makeup on and all that stuff. But slowly we've been pushing to turn on our cameras more and more because everybody misses that connection that you don't get without looking at someone, right? Or at least having more cues, like they might be on mute, but you're having cues of how they're
reacting.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is too, that is universal and it's never going to change, is that people remember how you made them feel more than what you had to say, right? So
that is I carry that all in life. I've always been my friends have always joked about how like inquisitive I am and how many questions I like to ask. And it's because I learned that saying a long time ago when I was younger. And I learned how, people like to feel good about themselves. And there's nothing better than asking people questions about them. And not only, and I don't do it out of selfish reasons. I mean, I'm genuinely interested about everyone I meet. Like I actually want to know who you are and what you do. But it's true. It's such a nice reminder. People remember how they feel.
And that all wraps together with the whole being a good communicator, and just thinking a very common, like when we were talking, I noticed my boss was texting me here and she was calling, like that must be important. So I just like quickly said, wrapping up a call it in 5 minutes, so she doesn't feel ignored, right? And that's the same thing. It's all about being compassionate. I think it's the big word, and we need more of that in today's world.
I think what's going to be interesting, Debora, is when our society goes from what we're doing today, and like with all this technology, we're all connected right now in like at least 2 different ways, whether it's phone, text, LinkedIn, whatever it is. It'll be interesting then going back, kind of like what I experienced recently, but going back and seeing how people start reacting or handling the in-persons, because like when you're in person with a client, are you going to look at your phone? No, I hope not. Are you going to put your like out of office message now, because everyone's so used to everyone being at their computer and being in their office that now when we start going back, what if I don't get a response for 6 hours? Should I be worried? You know what I mean? It's mind-boggling to think about. But I really loved like this conversation, Debora, because it was really nice, I think, to have this discussion around the reminders and the tips and the tricks of how to not let technology like run our lives, like to remember we're humans, and like communication is still important, right? No matter how you're communicating, it's still extremely important.
Right, exactly. And if you are using technology, you still need to consider those elements, right? Because if you're writing an email, like you said, you can add an exclamation point, or you can make something bold to emphasize that, you know, that's what you're trying to emphasize. So it's just like keeping those elements into consideration just on the back of your head. It just starts getting more and more second nature, and you just like naturally become a better and better communicator.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Debora, I mean, I really love that you joined, and that, you know, this time around it worked out for our recording. And I wanted to know, like, are there any lasting thoughts that you have that you'd like to leave with the listeners, or any tips that we can leave off with?
Just remember, we all have more things in common than we don't. And play on that.
It's true. It's really great. It's a great point. And if anybody wanted to get in touch with you or reach out, what's the best way to communicate?
I am always on LinkedIn. It's a great way to communicate with me and connect. So I know you're going to be posting this there. If you can tag me on it, and then people can add me from there, I'll be happy. I love being a thought partner. So bounce ideas at me. Go, and I'll teach you how to give.
I love that. Of course. Now we know where our gift library is going to come from.
There you go.
Well, awesome. So what we'll do is we're going to post your link on the podcast, and we will let people add you and everything. And I just want to thank you again so much for joining us today. And for those of you out there, please go ahead and send a connection to Debora, and she'd be more than happy to connect with you. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love that. Have a great day, everybody.